Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. We're welcoming back to the podcast our resident higher education expert, David Austin Walsh. David, you should actually introduce yourself a little bit, because I forgot to ask if your institutional affiliation or anything has changed. So I don't want to give the game away, if anything.
Yeah, no, well, it has. So my name is David Austin Walsh. I'm a historian of the American right. I just wrote a book last year, Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement to the Far Right. And I am currently, what is my title now? I'm currently a college advising fellow at the University of Virginia. So I do pre-major academic advising for students, along with teaching classes about politics, history, and culture.
Great. Yeah, and so we wanted to just kind of take a step back to talk about what's going on with higher education in this country. And, we'll maybe get to the sort of broader picture at the end, but I wanted to sort of start out with the case of this guy, Mahmoud Khalil. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he is I believe, Palestinian descent, organizer, was a student at Columbia and one of the principal organizers of the, protests against the, atrocities happening in Gaza over the last, or going on a year and a half, I guess. At any rate, he is a green card holder and, so legal permanent resident. And his wife, an American, is 8 months pregnant with their first child. And he was kidnapped by ICE, who accused him, basically of, supporting terrorism. And that seems to be the pretext that they're going to go with to deport him to, I'm not even sure whether he would take him. But, it seems to be kind of indicative of a general, a general assault on immigrants or even tourists of any kind. I've heard stories. There's a German guy who was just visiting his family, ended up in an ICE, torture dungeon, solitary confinement for days. Random people who have legal or sort of semi-legal sort of tried to interact with the system, which is a total clusterfuck at the best of times, being scooped up, for, no reason. People who are legitimately in the country or would have previously flown under the radar, not been prioritized. Now it's just get anyone. It almost seems like they have quotas or something, but it also seems like any critic of Israel basically is being subject to particular scrutiny. The leaders of the activist movements, particularly in academia, who, have been visibly identified with the, cause of Palestinian rights, against the war in Gaza and the, decades long occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. And so I don't know, I guess for off the top, do you have, thoughts on how this is proceeding, in terms of this Khalil guy?
Well, things are fucked. That's, I mean, I there's only so many ways to dance around that basic issue. I mean, Khalil, the way that I've been thinking about this, because it's a little unclear to me where this latest round of escalations is coming from. I'm going to just use the most provocative analogy I can think of off the top of my head, because it's been in my brain for the past couple of days. And I think that it is I think it's valid in sort of describing and making sense of what's going on. I was actually just talking to a colleague of mine the other day who was reading the Ian Kershaw biography of Hitler. And we were talking about the Führer principle, the leadership principle, this idea that, the leader of the state, and you see this in various different contexts, but Kershaw is writing about Hitler. The leader of the state is in a sense above the law, and then is able to, through dint of providing direction and guidance, basically implementing policy that is beyond legal constraints. And this is paired with, in Kershaw's biography of Hitler, this concept, which he got it from a speech from a Prussian bureaucrat in 1934, this concept called working towards the Führer. So the idea is that if you are a mid-level bureaucrat in the Nazi regime, you are not simply waiting for orders to be handed down from your superiors, from Hitler on down. you're rather trying to anticipate the wishes and desires of the leadership and then preemptively translating that into policy. And part of that dynamic is also it's a form of sort of bureaucratic entrepreneurialism, organizational entrepreneurialism. So if you are able to best anticipate the wishes and desires of your leadership, that puts you in a better standing for promotion, to accrue additional bureaucratic power, et cetera. And I think that broadly speaking, that's been the defining characteristic of the Trump administration since he was inaugurated. And I think that I suspect that Mahmoud Khalil's disappearance, his kidnapping by ICE agents, and his imprisonment reportedly in this facility in Louisiana is part of this dynamic. In part because you've got a bunch of different people who are trying to take credit for his kidnapping and detention and eventual, they're trying to deport him. Marco Rubio has put out a number of different public statements saying that they want, with varying legal justifications. I believe now the line is he didn't commit a crime at all, but because he is a Hamas supporter, that's in some sense a violation of the principle of his green card, and hence he's got to go. Beitar, which is the revisionist Zionist organization, they're the sort of descendants of Vladimir Jabotinsky. They've been claiming credit for apparently giving the Trump administration a deportation list of a whole litany of pro-Palestinian activists, and are saying, oh, this is actually on us. We're the ones who are pushing forward with this. There's some indications that this might have come from the Columbia sort of alumni groups that obviously have been putting a lot of pressure on the university over the past 2 years now, around the protests. So I think it's a combination of all of that. And what's really, really frightening is that it just keeps escalating. So they disappeared Khalil, what was it, about 2 weeks ago now. There's been additional ICE raids on the Columbia campus. We haven't even talked about the funding freezes. We'll just bracket that. We'll get to that. They expelled the president of the Columbia Grad Student Union just earlier this week, or I guess last week now. Grant Minor. There's a real doubling down on all of this that is tremendously frightening. Yeah, things are fucked, and Columbia is a microcosm, I think, of the pressures that are being put to bear on universities across the country, both public and private. What's happening at Columbia is already beginning to redound on other campuses. I just read the other day that a transplant surgeon at Brown has been denied re-entry into the country despite also being a green card holder. Her name escapes me off the top of my head, but I believe she's of Syrian descent, the very minimum Middle Eastern descent. So obviously this is very much racially targeted. But even then, it's not just that. The guy at Logan Airport you were talking about, the German guy, I believe is still in an ICE detention facility in Rhode Island. He's not a student. He's not political. I think the reporting said that the only thing that he had on him was a marijuana arrest from like 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is clearly, we talk about whether the chaos is intended or if it's also just because Trump in his way is kind of lacking order just by the virtue of his temperament and such, but also the ways in which these targets seem to be of a piece, but also somewhat arbitrary. I want to come back to your very interesting points about Trump.
I know I put a lot out there.
No, it's a lot to unpack. And I especially want to come back to the point about Trump and being above the law. You had that Napoleon tweet, right? And then, of course, we could bring in Carl Schmitt and kind of like sovereign is he who decides on the exception and how that relates to kind of the emergency justifications he's bringing in. I mean, we have several things. Right now, the Rubio thing was all about a McCarthy era law, right? That is literally about like the Secretary of State getting to decide who's an enemy of the state and, who's against the national security interests and so forth. And that's the justification, even though, Mahmoud Khalil, they don't even pretend he broke any law, but he's an enemy of the state and so forth. And then we have, of course, the kind of 1798 Alien Invasion Act, which was used last to intern the Japanese. And that, of course, was during World War II. And so we can talk about that and the ways that the kind of entrepreneurial bureaucrats are taking initiative, right? And how that might relate to kind of the fascistic relationship between followers and leader and all that. But to return to, insofar as academia and higher education is part of the targeting or is linked to the xenophobic targeting and everything. Like, can we talk more about what you think ideologically or strategically the target of academia, the role that plays for Trump and this project?
Yeah, well, academia has been on the Trump enemies list, on the MAGA enemies list for a very, very long time. I mean, J.D. Vance said during the campaign that the professors are the enemy. And there's been rhetoric like that going back at least a decade now. I think there's a couple of things going on. One is the sense that, in part because of the Palestine protests, but I actually think that's less important than maybe what we could label wokeness, and I'll unpack that in a moment. But there's this sense on the right that the universities have been the primary incubators for resistance and opposition to not just the Trump administration, but the American right writ large and its various political and cultural projects over the past generation. Sorry, my cat's on the Bernie, come on.
Always welcome. Cats are always welcome.
Yeah, I saw yours earlier. So I do think, and part of this goes back to, it's interesting if you read conservative and right-wing literature, I mean, really dating back to the 1930s, there is this sense that the universities are against them, that the right does not have cultural hegemony, in part because of, liberal or leftist or communist control over the universities. And they've taken this very seriously over the years because of the educational purpose and training new cadres. That's one of the reasons why you have all of this investment from conservatives in student organizations, in academic groups. There's a number. My institution at UVA, there's a number of organizations and institutions within the university that are obviously funded by conservative foundations. They're not especially popular with students, but they're there to sort of contest the cultural space of the campus.
They have a lot of money to throw around, though, even whether
absolutely
like them or not. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what I think is maybe not unique, but especially pronounced with Trump and MAGA over the past 10 years has been this sense that the universities are, because they have defined themselves, and it's one of the things that keeps their coalition together, against wokeness. Whatever that means, it's a sort of movable feast. It means essentially what communism meant in the 1950s. It's something to define yourself against. But they see the universities as the primary incubator of that. And there is some truth to this in the sense that, what they mean by wokeness, what centrists and other sort of right liberals mean by wokeness often is used to describe the kind of social justice-y language that originated on college campuses and sort of spread out into the culture over the past 10 or 15 years. So I think that's a big reason why they think that the universities specifically are so important to bring to heel, because it was the center for a lot of the sort of intellectual and eventually, provided the basis for some of the movement opposition to Trump and Trumpism in the first term. I think also there is a sense that the universities and I've obviously been outspoken about this myself and have complicated feelings about it, but I do think that the universities, more so than most other American political, social, or economic institutions, did, even if their commitments were ultimately superficial, they went further than most in embracing the kind of DEI turn. That's obviously public enemy number one as far as the Trump administration is concerned. And so, and DEI and, there's various other things, were sort of, I don't want to oversimplify things too much, but they were ultimately products of the university. I mean, the first DEI programs were sort of formulated in California in the first, I believe, if I remember correctly, the first part of the 2010s, and essentially as a way to, continue attempts to diversify the faculty and the student body in spite of, various affirmative action decisions the Supreme Court handed down. So, I think that's why the universities are sort of front and center here. On top of that, and I think this is interrelated, universities are also a site of international politics, right? I mean, you have people who are coming in from across the country, across the world, to American colleges and universities as students, as teachers, et cetera. It's obvious that this is the front line for at least the legal immigration fight, because of just how many people are here on student visas or work visas, let alone people who are coming into the country to give guest talks or teach guest classes or something. Inevitably, higher education is going to be kind of on the front lines here. And then, of course, there's more sort of like big exogenous structural factors. I was just reading about in an interview with Michael Ignatieff. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he was the former president of the Central European University, formerly in Budapest, now in Vienna, and he was reflecting on how Viktor Orban went after his institution very explicitly when he first began to sort of accumulate power. This is just something out of the kind of autocratic playbook, right? You go after civil society, you go after the press, you go after universities. They're all part of the sort of common package.
The one weird thing that's seems fairly, well, maybe, I don't know, you tell me if it's new, but the linking, because of Gaza, the linking of the kidnapping and the kind of authoritarian crackdown on universities to actually fighting anti-Semitism, which, as we know, has been just abused terribly.
Oh, God,
but it's so funny in the face of like DEI is the enemy, but then to say that your principal reason is that you're trying to protect a minority group against anti-Semitism is a kind of a bizarre move for authoritarian fascists. So what do you make of all that?
Well, so there's a couple of things that need to be on the table here. One is, before I forget, I mean, the act that you mentioned, the McCarthy-era Act, the McCarran something act, but as written, McCarran, I forget who the other sponsor was, but as written originally, it was basically a mechanism that was used to deny entry to Jews suspected of having political radically left-wing beliefs, and that's part and parcel of a whole broad swath of legislation and federal policy. From that period. I mean, the Displaced Persons Act is case in point, written in 1948, was supposed to allow refugees from Europe into the United States, but it was written in such a way as to deliberately exclude Jews, but not the Volksdeutsch, not the expellees from Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states who are of German ethnic descent. So there is an irony here. I mean, I think that, so I'll say two things. One, my sense is that a lot of American Jewish institutions and organizations that are active on college campuses have been ambivalent about DEI for a very long time, and have at times either sought to push back against it or include Jews under the aegis of DEI. And when you think about, maybe there's an analogy that could be made to the Ukraine war. There is a large contingent of Ukrainian students in the United States and other organizations, and there's a large contingent of Russian students and organizations in the United States. But there's not, the question of who deserved American support and sympathy was never really won over the Ukraine war. Whereas with Gaza, you have two different student groups and faculty, two different groups on campuses, Palestinians and American Jews and some Israeli Americans, who are actively contesting the space. And the whole DEI infrastructure is just not set up to adjudicate like an actual political conflict with real, that's not just collapsible to, why can't we all just get along and embrace diversity? I mean, that's one of the downsides of the DEI turn. And this has been a point that, liberals have criticized the universities for this, so have leftists, but the way in which political disputes sort of became arbitrated and adjudicated by university administrations, which went great until there's a real massive political dispute that doesn't have a ready or easy solution. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I do this has been a tension certainly in American Jewish life for many, many years. Really since the 6-Day War, if not earlier. But this tension between the universalism of liberalism, of liberal values, of commitment to liberal democracy, and the ethno-nationalist particularism of Zionism. As embodied by the state of Israel, and especially since the Israeli state's sort of lurched to the right since the 1970s, but really, which has been accelerating over the past 20 years. So, you're in this situation where groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which are theoretically supposed to be, in defense not just of American Jews, but of the liberal values and the commitment to liberal pluralism that allow for Jewish life to thrive and have historically allowed for Jewish life to thrive in the United States, are now lining up with fascistic ethno-nationalists. And I think that sort of synergy between the Israeli right, the American right is a big driver of this. And you see this with some of the, this is explicit with some in the rhetoric of some of the donors. That guy at Columbia, or not Columbia, the guy at Harvard, whose name is now escaping me, but he was one of the ones who forced out the Harvard president, Claudine Gay, last year. Again, case in point.
I think it's also, worth mentioning in this context that the Trump administration is filled with, straight up neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
Elon Musk himself throwing a Sieg Heil, twice in his speech. The Doge teeny bopper fascists, a lot of them come out of the most like far right, psychopathically fascist neo-Nazi, communities, one called the Calm that, you can dig into if you like it. It's just like some of the worst stuff you'll ever see. On like,
but Ryan, if you read right-wing Jewish publications like Tablet, which has gone completely off the fucking deep end over the past year. If you read the Jerusalem Post, I don't read Hebrew, but if you read in translation some of the other Israeli publications, they all defend Musk. They all defend the openly fascistic guys. Because they support Israel. It doesn't matter if they're, conspiratorial anti-Semites who believe in this sort of vast left-wing Jewish conspiracy to replace white people in the United States. They support Israel because they support the principle of ethno-nationalism.
No, exactly.
I gotta say, it's not too different from the weird way in which Christian nationalism has basically said that white supremacy is what Christianity is, much to the chagrin of so many Christians, right? So I think there's a parallel there a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, no, but the last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a new deputy Pentagon press secretary named Kingsley Wilson, who has spread I guess from the researchers into extremism say that this is one of the most obscure type of neo-Nazi conspiracy theories out there, but it's that Leo Frank was not falsely accused and lynched. And Leo Frank, of course, he was a guy he was convicted, I believe, in like a rigged trial with like tons of anti-Semitic stuff happening in it, and then later, lynched by a mob in 1915. And the Anti-Defamation League was founded explicitly in response to that happening. And now, someone with a fairly high position in the military, you'd think this would be a sort of hair on fire emergency for anyone who cares about, anti-Semitism. And yet instead it's used, the legacy of the Holocaust and stuff is used, to throw Palestinian people, into internment camps, disappear them. And, I was just reading an article in the Times of Israel, and the ADL did put out a statement saying that this is no good, but it's nothing like the type of appropriate reaction you would think to something like this. It's like, imagine Joseph Goebbels is appointed to a high ranking post in the American military, the most powerful military in the world. And they're just sort of like, well, that's not great, but, we have bigger fish to fry. It's crazy. And, I mean, you could sort of imagine. In fact, I think I've heard this said on the Israeli right that, well, if anti-Semitism rises worldwide, well, that's actually good for Israel because it's going to mean that all the Jews in the world are going to have to flee, and we're going to be able to beat the Palestinians in the demographic race. But, Israel is not a particularly defensible place. That could be a bad strategy in the long term. If you're, turning over America to Hitler 2.0.
Another accelerationism. Yay.
I'd also like to bring up, so David, you spoke about, this like attempt to core out DEI and so on. But it seems that the, Trump Musk attack on higher education has expanded way beyond that to just like attacks on universities, period. And not just universities, all of the
research period.
Yeah. Not just this education part of the universities, but like all the science that happens at all of these. Like these are some of the most important institutions in the world, the highest quality scientific research that's done anywhere. And like half of it is supported by government grants. We're just seeing sweeping cuts Johns Hopkins just laid off like 4,000 people or something because they got a whole bunch of grants cuts. We talked about the $400 million cut to Columbia, the National Institutes of Health, losing all types of researchers in like pediatric brain cancer, getting laid off, projects stop, trials that, for people with like, previously untreatable stuff. You're going for like the Hail Mary. Maybe this will work. We have a theory. That stuff's being cut off in all sorts of places. And, institutions that aren't, maybe they're sort of tangentially attached to a university-wide DEI policy, but don't have really anything to do with that. We're talking about, stuff that's like, what are we doing with this research? Well, we're going to pay for this, and then we're going to give it to a pharmaceutical company, and then everyone's going to make billions of dollars, core economic functions of how America is a prosperous place. And specifically in a lot of red states, like the University of Alabama in Birmingham is like the biggest employer in the state. Texas University is huge, important, and billions of dollars in economic productivity and beneficial research, which maybe isn't often like, deployed in a way that benefits everyone the most, but still, is just like a core part of the economy. And that's under attack. And so, do you have any thoughts, David, on this sort of like broader assault on, just like the university period?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's that is the biggest rupture with any sort of past assault on the university, because I was reading, I can't remember where it was. I saw it on Twitter, but it was a paragraph or two written, or it was an interview with this guy who declined to give his name, but he said he was a STEM professor at some big public university. And he's like, yeah, my colleagues and I, we voted for Trump, not because we were really on board with him, but because we were sick of our like woke colleagues in the humanities. And we did not expect us to be on the chopping block in the way that we have been. And, yeah, there's look, I'll cop to more than a little bit of Schadenfreude there, because, but a couple of things here. One question that I have, and I don't know the answer to, but I have my suspicions that I wonder if we've seen the same level of, because it seems to be mostly targeted at basic science cuts. Obviously they did away with the NSF grants, with healthcare research, et cetera. But to my knowledge, we haven't seen like massive cutbacks in like defense contracts. Like nobody's like, to my knowledge, they're not like pulling funding from, like hypersonic research. I could be wrong. That might be, but that's a big question that I have. How far do these cuts go? Are they completely across the board? Or are there carve outs for, sort of the defense industry? That's one question. But more broadly, I mean, my instinct here, and this is, I think, true with the entire governing strategy so far of the Trump administration, and in large part I attribute this to Musk, is it seems like they're trying to do what Musk did to Twitter, which is to say you just basically fire everybody. And then there's various different terms for this business strategy, but you'd like fire everybody and then wait for something to break down. And then you decide, okay, that's actually mission critical. We need to restore that. But we can keep everybody else we laid off because they clearly aren't mission critical. So I wonder if that's the dynamic here. I mean, I think that helps to explain the rapid pace of the layoffs, the fact that some people have been rehired, but that they keep cutting these various departments. I think that there is a perception among the sort of people in the driver's seat policy wise that universities are full of administrative bloat, that they're not and which I mean is true. But that this is the most effective way to cut the bloat, is to, just issue these massive cuts, which also, have synergy with, their other political goals about bringing the universities to heel, and then sort of seeing where we are in a couple of months. It's a very reckless governing strategy, but I think that's and on top of that, I think that there's also, again, just taking a step back from the university specifically, my basic sense is that, and I've written a little bit about this, but that, the Trump administration, I think it was Quinn Slobodian who describe like a distinctive faction of right-wing accelerationists within the Trump administration. So like people who read Curtis Yarvin and whatnot. And I would go further than that. I would say that right-wing accelerationism is the governing strategy of the Trump administration. I don't think it's deliberate on their part in the sense that I don't think that they think that this is, going to, achieve some kind of optimal political or policy outcome. I think it speaks to a kind of libidinal desire to, in the old Silicon Valley term, move fast and break things and provoke a response. And then when the response is provoked, then you can crush it. Because you got to remember, a lot of the guys who are now in positions of real authority, including in the military, which is the terrifying part, thought that the big mistake in 2020 was not to just send in the army to shoot all the George Floyd protesters. I think that there is a real kind of fantasy, even if it's not explicitly stated, of like, we want to be able to do 2020 again, but this time we can just shoot people or throw them into prison or, do the helicopter rides, those awful Pinochet jokes that they always make. So I think that's part of this, as well, but it doesn't, I agree that it's, going to be tremendously economically, counterproductive, but I just don't think that that's in the forefront of the policymakers' minds.
Yeah. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but, it's, I think, wildly inappropriate to think of a university like a business. In fact, that's probably a big reason why so many of them are struggling today is because of a longstanding move to try to get neoliberal logic into the academy. But like Musk basically did a sort of private equity bust out on Twitter, the company that, he owned himself. And I think the thing that, kind of floats under the radar with private equity sometimes is that a lot of times that kills the company. They basically strip the wiring out of the walls for a short-term profit. And half the time it ends up being an abuse of the bankruptcy law. You're basically, committing fraud in a moral sense on the prior bondholders of the company, cause you load it up with a shit ton of debt, pay yourself a huge amount of money. The company goes bankrupt and you already have your piece. And so it's all the people who lent the company money before who get ruined. And that's just because of how the bankruptcy law happens to be set up. And that's true of Twitter too. I'm convinced Twitter would be bankrupt and non-functional if it weren't for ongoing subsidies from Elon Musk, because the people that it's like the website is now very rickety and unstable. It went down for hours a few days ago. But a lot of the people he fired were responsible for bringing money in. They were responsible for making sure that, the whole moderation, system that he basically just got rid of. So now you can post like snuff film, kill yourself on a live stream on x.com, the everything app. Somebody literally did that the other day. They were making crypto memes about this dude. And, that was important to Twitter's business model. The only reason it ever made a profit ever in its life was, you're selling ads. And so the ads, you have to take brand safety very seriously, or Nike's not going to come and, they don't want their posts appearing next to snuff films and, Nazi memes and shit like that. That's not good.
I'm sorry. That gives a new, I'm sorry to make such a tasteless joke, but it brings new meaning to the term. Just do it.
Exact. No, I mean, like that is a thing that would occur to a Nike marketing executive. You don't want that. Yeah. To just do it. Bang. So just because it's owned by the richest person in the world, at least for the time being, they don't have to make money, and so, to think that you could apply this approach to the university or to the government itself, university is a pretty difficult thing to set up. You're talking about a lot of long-standing, institutional structures that are hard to create and easy to break. And just like this logic of private equity, it doesn't even really make sense on a business perspective. It's like about just looting and not about making money over the preservation of a going concern. But it especially doesn't make sense applied to the university.
That's right. The university is not meant to be for profit, right? Neither is government. It's supposed to be run like a business. But even business is not meant to be. I mean, there were whole movies back in the 80s, like Wall Street, even Pretty Woman. I think we forget that Pretty Woman actually ends with the change in Richard Gere's, not just loving the prostitute, but realizing he shouldn't just be like a mergers and acquisitions shark, but he should actually invest in building things like ships. Like that's the whole actual point of the shift in Richard Gere's character. And so like even within business, the Elon Musk, who by the way has been federally subsidized for most of his economic success, right? Even he is a terrible business person in terms of actually keeping institutions thriving. But the religion of neoliberalism applied to the university and the markets intruding on the university and government spaces, which are quite specifically meant to buffet against market forces. This is what you see now with the post office threat, right? Where like, oh, do we care about making sure people that are in rural areas actually have the mail, let alone hospitals? No, let's just let market forces screw them over. It's just, it reminds us of the connection between authoritarianism, neoliberalism, and oligarchy, right?
And to be clear, these are things that have been building on trends in higher education for years, if not decades, and have been really bipartisan in nature. I mean, I'm thinking about, most recently, this is just last year, the massive cuts at the University of Connecticut, which came down from, one of the bluest state governments in the country. They're eliminating, a number of different departments, most of which are not, direct applied sort of vocational training. And I see this with my students. I'm sure, Alexios, you see it too. Students are socialized from a very, very early age to view higher education in particular as ultimately transactional, as, okay, you major in a STEM field or a business degree, it's your ticket to the middle class, which is fine. I believe me, I am very sympathetic and try to be understanding and supportive of those concerns. But that's not what the purpose of the institution is. And it's, it's supposed to be a place for, and I mean this in a not sort of sentimental or, like Barry Weiss style, like free speech absolutist sort of way, but it is supposed to be a space for inquiry. And often what that means in practice is research on things. And this is honestly, I think, one of the reasons why they go after the NSF grants, research on things that do not have, or do not seem to have direct, capital, benefits. I mean, there's been a longstanding mockery on the right for years of, like studies that are about like it was one a few years ago. It was about the pressure per square inch of when penguins shit in Antarctica, which does sound kind of ridiculous. But on the other hand, I can think of at least half a dozen, genuine, like as part of understanding systems of, biology and ecology in Antarctica, like that. There is a genuine knowledge base that's embedded in and that is actively contributing to. And that's supposed to be the purpose of a university, to facilitate and allow for that kind of inquiry about the world that we live in. And that specifically is what's on the chopping block. Yeah,
it's not just that, there should be a space. I mean, I think it is a little, sentimental, but it should be. And it's sentimental in a good way that like, not everything is supposed to be about making money in the marketplace, like that.
We're talking about a public good. We're talking about what is a public good. And I think a university is, or it should be, a public good. Even private universities, they should be public goods.
Like, went to Reed College, and Reed College has a great books course that everyone has to take. And you read, the Bible and Aristotle and Homer and, bits of the Quran and all this other stuff. And it's like, this is about sort of transmitting our shared cultural heritage and, learning to think deeply about the big questions in life. Who are we and where are we going in this chaotic universe? And that's like that's an important thing. That's just like one of the most important things there is in life.
And it's the most anti-capitalist thing, because it's about understanding ends, not means. It's about understanding what goods are, things that are valuable in themselves, which is what the meaning of life is about. Like appreciating like the good, the true, the beautiful. These classical ideas are about the non-instrument, because what is an instrument for? It's to achieve some end. But the problem with capitalism is the end is the instrument, and accumulation itself is the end. And so, of course, it's going to be destructive of things that are focused on like actual ends and not instruments. That's just, that's the perversity of capitalism, right?
And also to inject a specific political consequence to this, if you don't have spaces like that, then where are people going to get that? Where not necessarily the answers to those questions. Where are people going to pose those questions? It's going to be at like fucking Jordan Peterson seminars. It's going to be, down YouTube rabbit holes. It's going to be buried by like a copy. I mean, it's going to be fascists, basically. Fascists love talking about this shit. I was just reading, because I'm teaching this tomorrow, literally just reading the fucking Doctrine of Fascism by Mussolini. And it's all about like, man's spiritual journey and shit like that.
This is why Rogan and Theo Von and all this right-wing media empire is so popular. It's filling the void of especially, white male, but just the right-wing void for thinking about the meaning of life and who you should be and what it means to be a man and all these questions. And unfortunately, these are the venues and the people that are leading them down the path to the answers, right?
And the other aspect to this, which you alluded to, David, is that, much in the way that private equity, it's like profit maximization ends up boomeranging. Like there's all kinds of research that, you don't know whether it's going to be commercially productive, and it might not be even in your own lifetime. Maybe it'll hook into something well down the line, and suddenly all of a sudden, we got a new breakthrough, and this turns out to be hugely valuable. The woman, I'm spacing on her name, but there was a Hungarian woman who developed like one of the core technologies behind mRNA vaccines. And she was working on it for decades, had this like wild haired idea, and just like bouncing around the fringes of academia for decades. Just getting a little grant over here, open a little grant over here. And it was a constant struggle for funding, because she wasn't super politically astute. But also, she'd go to these, boards and stuff like that. And they'd be like, well, we don't see how this is commercially relevant. So, sorry, not for you. And it just happened to be the case that when COVID hit, suddenly all this stuff came together, and a bunch of research, a big glug of research went behind it, and boom, suddenly now you have a hyper effective vaccine that can be developed over a weekend. And, it's like this, I guess it goes to show you the complete ridiculous nonsense of this American greatness crap that you hear from the right. They want to destroy what makes this country actually prominent. They want to destroy our scientific, research complex, like the most advanced, the most high profile, Nobel Prize winning, whatever you care to name, like this is the core of the scientific, elite in this country, and destroy all the, alliances with Europe and Japan and New Zealand and stuff. That is the core of the, American empire, frankly, such as it exists, and just in favor of this vision of a backward, uneducated, rabble that won't have access to any kind of higher education other than Joe Rogan podcasts that you listen to on your way to the, coal mine or whatever. And,
yeah, well, I think to build on that too, because, to go back to one of the questions about why are they targeting the sciences, I think part of it too is that if you spend any time, in right-wing Silicon Valley world, reading these blogs, listening to their TED Talks, all that shit, there is a real sense that, the actual important stuff that's being done is not being done at the universities. It's being done in the private sector. It's being done by, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. It's being done, the AI stuff is the latest iteration of this. And so, therefore, you don't need this like massive sprawling scientific investment by the state. That can all be done through startups and private equity. And I'm sure that there are some financial incentives to remove universities as a sort of competing source of knowledge. I mean, what was it last year where, I think it was at Livermore Labs where they did the first net positive cold fusion experiments, and that was a government laboratory. And it's something that has been the subject of considerable investment, considerable research for many, many years. It was a government laboratory that was able to actually do it. And I can see how that conflicts with an ideology that is all about, concentrating resources in the hands of private investors and private equity. On the flip side, though, I've just been reading this book by Alex Karp, and I forget the other guy's name. The Palantir Guys, The Technological Republic. I don't know if you guys come across this book yet.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it. I read the John Gann's review of it, I think.
Yeah, and I read Ganz's review too, and I agree with it in his typically scathing way. It was very, very, I think, fair-minded to it. It's an awful, awful book. But their explicit thesis is, well, Silicon Valley has, gone too far down the road of, just consumer capitalism, of just like chasing clicks and building all of their sort of research infrastructure around ways to dominate the attention economy. We need to bring it back to a sort of project of American grandeur and greatness. Okay, what is their actual project? What is going to proclaim the technological republic in their eyes? Oh, it's direct investment by the Pentagon into military applications of AI.
Yeah,
like we've seen being used in Gaza and so forth, right? With algorithmic assassinations and so forth. If we can, I'd like to bring it back to the beginning when you were talking about the kind of Trump and his inspiring his kind of minions and the low level bureaucrats to take initiative and kidnap people and whatever else. What do you think the relationship is between the kind of anti-intellectual, anti-education, ideological influence of MAGA? And I mean, I'm thinking of like Arendt and the need to think what we are doing and the distinction between thought and action, and how with Trump, he's all like impulse and action, and is anti-thought and order and planning and so forth. And I wonder if there's like this sense that like this valorization of people that just, do things, right? It's an interesting contrast to the Democrats who are just totally ineffectual and unable to act, right? But like this, even when the early Trump rallies, he would basically tell people, I'm going to cover your lawsuits and your bills or whatever happens. Just, if you take things into your own hands and I got your back, right? What do you think about this dynamic between his leadership and his kind of calling on people to just take initiative, and how it's kind of the opposite of thought, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there is, this has been a theme throughout our conversation, right? That so much of the action that is being taken is even if you just give it a little bit of thought, is counterproductive on its own terms. Even if you agree with the sort of broader political end goals, it's not actually, it's going to limit your ability to maneuver through new and subsequent crises. So I do think that is, and again, I was just reading, again, like I said, I was just reading The Doctrine of Fascism. And this is what Mussolini says fascism is. It is this kind of constant need for action. He talks all about how at one point I was a socialist and we would just like talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And this is the problem with liberals too. Fascism is the doctrine of action. I think that's right. I think that that's one of the reasons why the sort of classical analysis of fascism is that it's ideologically incoherent, which I agree with. And I think that's also true of the Trump administration. I think that there's a number of different competing impulses that are at work. Sometimes they clash. We saw that with the H-1B visa issue. But more often than not, they're free to kind of go off in any number of different directions. I mean, I forget who it was, but there was a conservative pundit who maybe it was one of the liberals. It might have been an Atlanta guy for all I know. It wouldn't surprise me. But was, making positive comparisons to FDR's 100 days in the Trump administration and saying that this is the most impactful a president has been since FDR's 100 days, which I think is probably true. But, it's coming from a very, very, very different political standpoint, a very, very different intellectual standpoint. The whole point of the 100 days, as far as the Roosevelt administration was concerned, was to put into practice these ideas to solve this intractable geopolitical crisis, and socioeconomic crisis that have been engulfing the world for almost 5 years at that point. And considerable thought had been put into the solutions. It was just a question of amassing political will around them. Whereas this is, again, I keep going back to the Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things, which I think did always have kind of these like, not to relitigate the fascism debate again, because I really am fucking sick of that. But but I remember, even at the height of the debate in the first Trump administration, one of the things I kept saying was that, the real kind of intellectual home of contemporary American fascism is not in, fucking David Duke's movement or the various other groups that were rallying here in Charlottesville at Unite the Right, but in Silicon Valley. in these kinds of ideologies that have been floating around Silicon Valley for a very, very long time and have sort of achieved special urgency over the past 5 or 6 years. And this is, I think, related to their profitability crisis, which is also one of the reasons you have the AI hype. So I think
does that help explain why like they're cutting things for veterans and you have all these like Republican town hall meetings where the veterans and others are pissed off and they're just like doing things that you would think they wouldn't want to do because it's their base. But if you think of it the way that you're just explaining, maybe it makes more sense, right?
I think so. I mean, I think that this sort of need to do the what did LBJ say? The fierce urgency of now. They have the power now. The Democrats are cowed now. They have, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, they have the law on their side now. This kind of, I mean, one of the things that I think is important to underline here, and this pushes back a little bit against the, like, this is like, authoritarianism, fascism, whatever thesis, but I think it doesn't if you actually unpack it, is that there is a comparative lack of resistance in our various institutions and civil society and all the rest of it. That's not necessarily guaranteed to be there a year from now, even 6 months from now. And so when you are in a position where your enemies are in retreat across the board, or they're in disarray, or they've proven to be completely ineffectual, as Chuck Schumer has been, that's when you run the playbook, you run across the board. And that's sort of anathema to the kind of, deliberative, to put it nicely, liberalism that we've sort of been accustomed to by the Democratic Party, certainly in my adult life, going back to 2008 and then the financial crisis. We've never seen in my lifetime a Democratic administration move as quickly, rapidly, and effectively, at least in accomplishing their specific political goals as the Trump administration has been. So, that's to say, I mean, I think that when you are in a political moment where your movement, your ideology demands movement, it can and will lead to a seemingly politically counterproductive thing. But that's part of what being in that moment is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it strikes me that a decent slogan for FDR and the New Dealers would be move fast and fix things. Just
move fast and build things. That's what they did.
Yeah. They did. Yep. And they were Bureau of Reclamation, building the first, second, third, and fourth largest man-made objects in history all at the same time. And they all came in on time and under budget. Yeah. Imagine Andrew Cuomo trying to do that. Yeah. It'd cost $700 trillion. Yeah, I guess we're running short of time. I just wanted to share, on the subject of DEI and JD Vance, there's a tweet from the Hell Dude, aka Jeff Computers, aka Rachel News, and sundry other pseudonyms. He had a post. He posted one of his previous posts at JD Vance that, quote, JD Vance is the ultimate DEI guy, an OSU grad with a compelling story, did not go to prep school, who they let into Yale Law School and treated like a shaved ape that they taught to drink sparkling water and later paid for a Senate seat for. A uniquely American story. And in response to that, whoever is running the Twitter sort of, thought crime division, they blocked that, access to that post. And then later to all of his tweets in general. And JD Vance was still fuming about it days later. And I think maybe that could be where some of this is coming from, from a guy who was led into an Ivy League law school, not through the usual, channels, and has developed seething, sublimated self-contempt, for not, quote unquote, deserving it. And so has decided to retaliate against all knowledge of any kind.
I think that's right. I know we're running short of time, but let me share a quick little story with you guys. I went to go see Dan McLaughlin speak at UVA a couple of weeks ago. Do you know who he is? He's the angry baseball crank.
The baseball crank, yes.
The baseball crank, yeah. National Review contributor. One of the conservative student groups was hosting him, so I went with a couple of my friends. asked him some very cutting and hostile questions at the end of his remarks. It was interesting. I asked him, because he talked about, so a couple of interesting points about this. One, he actually used the term blood and soil nationalism, and he meant it as a good thing. He was like, we need to have a form of blood and soil nationalism here in the United States. And, so the question I asked him was, okay, you talk about the need for respecting tradition and authority and all the rest of it. What is the American tradition? Who is authentically an American? He didn't really have a great answer for that. But one of the things that he, before the Q&A, one of the things he kept going on about, and I've heard this from conservatives throughout my lifetime, is, this sense, he said something effective, back in the 1980s, liberals took conservatives seriously. They took our ideas seriously. They seemed to respect us. That we were part of we were part of the serious sort of conversation and dialogue. And that's just not the case anymore because of the wokeness and all that shit. And I think that I think it does speak. I think he was being very honest in his own way about a deep sort of intellectual insecurity on his part, that, he's not taken seriously by the interlocutors he would like to be taken seriously by on the left. It kind of goes back to my theory that this whole idea of respectable conservatism, which conservatives are very invested in, at least the sort of National Review crowd historically have been, is ultimately a creation of liberalism. It's what liberals give to conservatives to make them serious interlocutors. And that just, that's not really an intellectual dynamic anymore. And in part because to take Dan McLaughlin seriously is to just ignore 30 years of scholarship on, among other things, on American slavery. The guy is talking about how Robert E. Lee was a great American. So there's only so much you can do with that. So I do think that at least part of the attacks on the university are a kind of crude revenge fantasy that they finally are in a position to enact. And unfortunately, it has to be said in large part because of how expensive college is, in part because of the sort of transactional attitude that we were discussing earlier. I don't know that there's a mass constituency that can be mobilized to defend universities as institutions anymore. In a way that maybe there was 50 years ago before the institution of this sort of modern system of student debt to govern universities' conduct in life. So, it's a very scary time. I'm not going to talk about what's going on specifically here at UVA because I'm a staffer. I don't want to put myself in any sort of jeopardy there. But just from what I'm seeing in this state, what I'm seeing across the country, the conversations I'm having with colleagues, at the minimum, I can predict this, that I don't think that the existing system of higher education as it has existed in this country since the 1970s, which has been deeply flawed, but, has had good things about it too. I don't know that that's going to exist in 6 months. I really don't.
And as you point out, that's in no small part because of not just Reagan and the reactionaries, but what liberalism and neoliberalism has done. And that's true, as we talked earlier, too, when you come to the student protests and immigration in Gaza and how Biden did us no favors and kind of paving the way for this kind of treatment of anti-genocide protests as potential terrorist subjects, right?
I was at Columbia when they cleared the encampment the first time. I was actually giving a book talk at the J School. And then when I was done, somebody was at the window and said, "Oh, look, the cops have come in and they're clearing out the encampment." And the degree to which, I remember saying this on Twitter back in April, I don't know if I can vote for Joe Biden because of what's happening on the university campuses. What was the point of 4 years of anti-fascist organizing if you get a liberal into office and this is the outcome? Yeah. It's so I do think that especially with Mahmoud Khalil and the disappearances and also the opportunistic use of union busting by the universities, I think this is all accelerating. This is all building off of what was already, potentially on the table under the Biden administration, but the political possibilities have expanded very much for the worse as far as these actors are concerned. And I don't think, I was reading Chuck Schumer's interview in the New York Times, and I've read a number of other statements by senior Democrats, and other liberals, and the sort of line, especially on Mahmoud Khalil, is, well, fuck this guy. He's a terrorist, but we have to believe in due process. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? Right. If you cannot defend this guy who by all accounts was a pretty like thoughtful and moderate voice in the student encampments. If you can't defend this guy on the merits, then what the fuck are you doing?
Right. In the same way that after the George Floyd protest, and this is the way, part of the way in which liberalism facilitates fascism, right? Like to say, okay, well, what we need is more cops, and actually our carceral system and the police generally are good. It's like, well, then you're just whitewashing the real problem, which is most people don't encounter it, but we already have fascistic systems here, and don't pretend they're good, right? Yeah.
You know, to your point, David, like it's hard to see any chance of the universities, you know, being able to weather the storm if they won't even stick up for themselves. You know, we see it's like after, you know, a year of bending over backwards to appease right-wing grievance, you know, to the point of, you know, firing the black president of Harvard or forcing her to step down, that as a result of a campaign that was basically organized as a scalp hunting expedition, in those words.
By Bill Ackman, his name came to me. Bill Ackman,
and Chris Rufo saying this, explaining publicly on Twitter that he was just trying to get this lady more or less because she's black. And then doing that with the overt support of the New York Times. And the right just pocketed that victory, and they're asking for more.
Yeah, capitulation is not the method for bullies or fascists, right? Bullies love weakness. They love to smell weakness.
Appeasement.
Well, this is also one of. Sorry, I know we're almost out of time, but one of the things I did want to add to all of this, which is maybe a minor issue. Well, I don't think it's that minor of an issue, but it's you know, it's a knock-on effect supposedly of the funding cuts and freezes. Is a number of universities are stopping admitting grad students. And that's going to destroy disciplines. It's also an anti-labor measure. I mean, this was at, what was it? Was it Brown, or it was one of the Ivies where, maybe it was Penn. Basically, they stopped, admitting grad students more or less. No, it was Boston. It was Boston University. Stopped admitting grad students basically as a retaliatory measure against the union winning an election. So not only do you have universities that are actively complicit in all of this stuff, they're also opportunistically using this moment to further crush opposition to the hegemony of the very liberal administrative class that is, in theory at least, being targeted by the Trump administration. So, you know, it's a smash and grab all the way down.
Which side are you on time and history right now?
Yeah. Oh, geez. Well, David, thanks for coming on. We will link your recent book that we talked about on our last show in the show notes, and to Chuck Schumer's amazing interview at the New York Times. Really got to read it to believe it. Some real galaxy brain shit going on in that particular head. But yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you in the next episode.